what took place in Germany in the 30s was a particularly visible, well-documented example of a pattern that is much more common in human history. And because this pattern emerges as a result of certain features of the way evolution functions in the context of humans, it is actually always a danger that it will reemerge. And knowing what to do about it is not so simple until you've seen why it occurs and what it means. What I've been saying in lectures I've given on this is that tyranny is the end game of prosperity. And so there is a pattern in which you will go through a period of prosperousness in which it appears that that thing is defeated once and for all. And there's no reason for people to be going after each other in this particular way. And then at the point that that pattern peters out, it reemerges and people don't expect it. It flies under a different flag or something like that. And so I do think that looking at the tiny number of people who were doing what they were doing in Charlottesville and saying, well, we all agree that this is wrong, misses the fact that actually, I think Trump is doing it cynically, but Trump was riding a wave, that there are ideas which are not permissible from the environments in which we all grew up that are going to become permissible again if we are not careful to recognize that that's the nature of history.
I think it's highly probable that that's going to occur. I mean, part of the reason that I landed in the political hot water that I landed in last year was because I was increasingly aware that this process of polarization was going to take place, and that the continual, in my estimation anyways, the continual clawing of new ground underneath the radical leftist rubric, especially in the universities, is starting to produce an extraordinarily dangerous counterposition. And that was manifest, at least to some degree, in Charlottesville. And so I think you're right, is that, well, you don't want to be complacent and say, well, we know who the Nazis are and we're not going there, and so the problem is solved. The problem isn't solved. There's all sorts of weird activity in the non-radical left space, like on the other side of the radical left, whatever that is. And right now, what it is not obvious. You know, it's the alt-right, that's part of it. It's the Kekistanis, it's this peppy thing. It's some of it's comedy, some of it's satire, some of it's serious, some of it's the inversion of identity politics, which is very dangerous. And it's maybe the most dangerous thing about Charlottesville is that there's something extraordinarily dangerous about having people revert to identification with their racial identity. It's really not a good thing.
Well, there's the reversion to their racial identity. There's basically an outbreak of tribalism, which explains what's going on the far right. What's going on the left is a bit of a new twist. What you have is a coalition of different tribal identities that aren't large enough to marshal a force on their own, and so they're united. And together, they are a formidable force. But what's going to happen is that's an unstable entity. At the point that that force gains power, it's going to come apart as internal dynamics rip it up. So it's not actually it's not capable of restraining the version that recurs on the right, the version that does manifest as white nationalism. That version is stable because it does represent an actual population that has an evolutionary basis for remaining cohesive. And I should point out, there's a danger when you hear an evolutionary biologist talk about evolutionary patterns. People often infer that if an evolutionary biologist is saying that something is a pattern that has evolved, that that's some kind of a defense, and it is absolutely not. We call this the naturalistic fallacy. Mm-hmm. So evolution is an absolutely amoral process. It has produced the most marvelous features of human beings and the worst features, and we are in some sense obligated to pick and choose which features to honor and promote and which ones to tamp down.
Something can have evolved as a virtue in some circumstances and still be of the type that, if magnified beyond its proper limits, becomes pathological. So let me tell you something I learned about Hitler, which really, I haven't recovered from my shock from this. So we've been looking at the relationship between political belief and personality. Okay, and your political belief is strongly determined by your temperament. So liberal left types are high in trait openness, that's creativity, and low in conscientiousness. But you can fragment conscientiousness up into industriousness and orderliness. And the real predictor for conservatism is in orderliness, not industriousness. And you might think, well, that's no surprise. Right-wingers are more orderly, hence Hitler's call for order, let's say. But it's one thing to posit that and another thing to measure it. Now it's measurable. And it appears that orderliness is associated with sensitivity to disgust. And this is actually a really big deal. It's a really big deal. So there's a paper that was published in PLOS One about 3 years ago looking at the relationship between the prevalence of infectious diseases and authoritarian political attitudes. And they did it country by country and then within countries by state or province. And the correlation between the prevalence of infectious diseases and authoritarian/right-wing political beliefs at the local individual level was 0.6. And so I want to take this apart a little bit. Okay, so the idea is that this is part of what you might describe as the extended behavioral immune system. And one of the problems with the interactions between groups of human beings in our evolutionary past was, well, exactly what happened to the Native Americans is, they came out and shook hands with the Spanish conquistadors, and then within a couple of generations, 90% of them were dead of smallpox and measles and mumps. And so it's been a truism in our evolutionary past that if you meet a group of if you're a group of isolated humans and you meet another group of isolated humans and you trade pathogens, there's a real possibility that you and everyone you know are going to be dead in no time flat. And so we have a disgust mechanism that produces this implicit, let's call it racial and ethnic bias that is part and parcel of the human cognitive landscape. But the problem with that is that it's rooted in a disgust mechanism that actually serves a protective function. Now, when I was sorting this out, I was reading Hitler's Table Talk, and Hitler's Table Talk is a very interesting book. It's a book of his spontaneous mealtime utterances from 1939 to 1942. And I went through with this new knowledge because people think of conservatives as or fascists as afraid of those who are different. They're not afraid. They're disgusted. And that's not the same thing because you burn things you're disgusted by. And so it was terrifying to me to read it because then I also thought, oh, well, disgust sensitivity is associated with orderliness, and you need order in a society in order to maintain it. And the Germans are very orderly, and that was actually a canonical part of their civilization and part of actually what makes them great and powerful. And that just had to tilt a little farther than necessary. And all of a sudden, everything needed to get cleaned. And, Hitler talked about cleanliness all the time, and he actually meant that. And so this thing that's emerging, you talked about its biological basis, its evolutionary basis. It's part of this deeply rooted disgust system that protects us from dangerous pathogens that can manifest itself and does manifest itself in the political realm. It's not good.
So I don't know exactly how to tease this apart, but I agree with your point about there's an actual danger when populations meet, like a literal pathogen danger, and that is liable to have produced a certain instinctive fear of the other, which doesn't have to be limited to that one thing, but that's enough to generate a selective force that would cause a certain reluctance to meet. But I want to point out that at least in the West and probably universally, human beings when they go to war tend to dehumanize the other population. And, so of course calling the other population subhuman, vermin, whatever it is that human beings do. And my concern is that we are doing exactly this with the Nazis or de facto Nazis who are showing up on our screens at this point. That what we are doing is we are comforting ourselves by saying, well, that's a small outbreak of something that makes these people subhuman, justifies punching them or whatever. And I'm not squeamish about there being a right to violence when somebody is threatening a way of life. So it's not that. But my concern is that if you take the pathogen model and you imagine that all those folks who showed up in Charlottesville, that is a contagion and it needs to be isolated, then you will have the sense that as long as you do that, it's not going to show up somewhere else. Whereas what's, I think, the actual hazard is that that's actually a latent program that has served populations in past circumstances. It's indefensible, but it has served populations, and the populations that we come from have it, therefore, on reserve. And when certain characteristics show up in the environment, that program can emerge. And so my concern is that that's where we are in history.
Right. It can't be isolated as a phenomena that's associated with the other.
Right.
I mean, one of the things I've done for decades is teach my students a variant of that, which is something like, because I try to walk them through psychological understanding of what happened in Nazi Germany and in the more intense situations like in places like in Auschwitz. So the question might be, well, if you were in Germany in the 1930s, could you be a concentration camp guard? And the gut reaction to that is, no, those people are unlike me. And that's the wrong response. The right response is, those people were human and I'm also human. And so that means that the Nazi is us. That's what it means. And so, and who the hell wants to think that? And no one will think that. And I have thought that through, because I thought through, for a variety of reasons, what the limits of my potential behavior are. And the limits of my potential, and maybe I'm more pathological than the average person, it's certainly possible, but I understand that the limits of my potential behavior are far beyond the bounds of what people would normally consider civilized. And I think that's characteristic of human beings in general.